Have you ever sat down to read a book, but the next thing you know, some notification pops up on your phone, and before you know it, your best intentions to read end up turning into 2 hours of scrolling instead? Well, even as a published academic who loves learning, I've been there myself. In this video, I'm going to teach you the exact 4 steps I used not only to replace almost 90% of my screen time with reading, but also to make it feel as addictive as scrolling on my phone. And none of these steps really works in isolation, so if you skip any of them, it might just be the reason you continue to struggle. Starting with the first step, don't try to get off social media. In the past, I've tried forcing myself to turn off my phone or lock it away somewhere while simultaneously setting up comprehensive book lists and schedules to essentially force myself to stop scrolling and spend more time reading and learning. But in many ways, this only made me want to scroll on my phone more. It made me feel like I was depriving myself, and little did I realize I was actually establishing a negative feedback system in my brain that made me associate reading with pain and deprivation. And then when, as you could expect, I went on to fail at achieving my reading goals, I ended up only feeling guilty and bad about myself. Sound familiar? Well, this is why you're probably failing to get off your phone and replace that time with more reading, too. But if this approach just doesn't work, then what's the alternative? Well, the goal of the remaining 3 steps here is to essentially recreate in your brain all the physiological reasons you gravitate to your phone in the first place, and simply direct those physiological impulses toward reading instead. But how do we achieve that? Well, that's what brings us to step 2, manufacture interest. So in order to really understand how to become genuinely excited to read and even physiologically compelled to read, we first have to understand how that same process occurs when we're scrolling on our phone. So some months I have a pretty packed teaching schedule, and eventually, without noticing it, I started to fall into the habit of filling my empty time between classes with lounging on my bed, scrolling through my social media feed, and watching video after video. And why? I felt like I needed to unwind. You see, teaching is so mentally demanding, and to really be effective in a session, I need my full attention and focus. And so I felt, hey, I deserve some break, so I'm gonna take it. And at first, this seemed to work. I wasted away my time watching videos until my next session came around, only to find that after that class was finished, it would happen again. I would feel the urge to go back to my phone and keep binge watching and scrolling. But that feeling of mental recovery I got, it really was just an illusion. Over time, I started to realize something strange. The more time I spent supposedly relaxing on social media, the more tired and also the more depressed I actually started to feel. Yeah, I actually started feeling depressed from it. You see, our brains are novelty-seeking machines, and the process of evolution has shaped us this way. We are programmed to want to chase or spot the newest thing because, in short, this is a very useful survival mechanism for us humans. But the problem is that social media is a little bit like consuming junk food. When you eat junk food, your blood sugar spikes, making you feel temporary energy and a feeling of pleasure. But then it quickly crashes, leading to even more cravings for junk food. And this cycle repeats and repeats and repeats. Replace those greasy French fries with your phone, and the effect is basically the same. So what's the solution, and how did I break the cycle myself? Well, you absolutely must manufacture interest. You have to do the same thing you would do if you wanted to start exercising consistently, which is essentially to do something so you start building momentum. You see, when I started exercising consistently, it had very little to do with just forcing myself to go to the gym. Instead, I started going to the gym for 15 minutes, 3 times per week at first. The point is, this small action helped me build momentum toward the new habit, and then from there, how I started to look and feel as I went more consistently kept me going. So that's exactly what you have to do with reading. Yes, it's true. Simply having interest in a topic won't provide those dopamine hits to keep you motivated and consistent long term. But if you simply start with a book, any book, a graphic novel, even a magazine, and even if it's motivated by what you perceive to be a very shallow reason or interest, it's going to start to build and reinforce this habit of getting dopamine hits and pleasure from your reading. For me, I genuinely started to get more interested in certain topics in philosophy, specifically the fundamental concepts of truth, meaning, and probability. But the key question is, among everything you're consuming on social media, what's one of those topics you're most interested in? And not just somewhat interested in, like super interested, even obsessed. That's a great place to start because chances are there's a book on that topic you can start reading. And once you take that small step, that's when this process really gets going. Which brings us to step 3 in this process: create a book thread. Okay, so here's where things start to get genuinely fun and where you start to want to read books more than you want to spend time on your phone. So when I read books, I don't just read one book at a time typically. I usually read multiple of them at once. And in order to create what I call a book thread, you don't have to read multiple at once, but I at least urge you to try it and you'll see why. So once I start reading a particular book, the majority of the time, here's what happens. I usually notice some thinker or author who's mentioned in the book, or I see some interesting list of books in the bibliography, or I simply learn of some new concept or an old concept I realize I need to brush up on. And what does that naturally get my brain to do? Well, remember when we said that your dopamine levels spike when you see some new video to click on? Well, the same thing happens when you see some new concept or new thinker that's mentioned. But again, this will only happen if you're genuinely super interested in that topic. So for instance, a few months ago, I was reading a book by the linguist Noam Chomsky, and he had some commentary comparing and contrasting human versus animal communication. And in my mind, I said, aha, reading about animal communication could probably really help me understand truth and meaning more clearly on a cognitive level. And this led me to the book Animal Languages by Eva Major. So now, suddenly, I was reading 2 books at once related to the same topic. And then, as I reviewed some classic articles by the philosophers of language, Bertrand Russell, Alfred Tarski, and John Searle, I started to realize they were founding a lot of their ideas on axioms and postulates, which got me thinking more deeply about the idea of axioms and postulates more generally, which led me then to review books on non-classical logic and also Kolmogorov's probability theorems. And all of this eventually led me to ask myself, how would post-structuralists, who are in a completely different school of thought, react to or think about these concepts? Which then led me to go back and reread Of Grammatology by the post-structuralist philosopher Jacques Derrida. This is what I mean by creating a book thread. The idea here is that one book should lead to another, and to another, and to another. And as I said, although I love reading multiple books at once, you don't have to. You can simply line them up to be read in a certain order. But here's where you want to be careful. Again, you don't want to make this a drag. Sure, line them up in a certain order to be read, but don't be married to that order. What I found as I'm reading is that I'll often have the intention to read certain things in a certain order or certain books on certain days, but I'll suddenly realize I'm just not in the mood to read about that particular topic that day. Instead, I found myself really wanting to read the most recent book I got, or some other book instead. And again, when you're following this thread organically, it keeps you motivated. But even more importantly, when you read this way, you train your mind not simply to look at one idea or one topic from one angle or with one specific bias. What trains your critical thinking ability more than anything else is your ability to examine a topic holistically, understand all perspectives, and come to a conclusion based on a highly informed perspective. But at this point, you might be asking, where the heck am I gonna get all these books? It's not like I have tons of money to spend. And that's okay. I live in New York City, and here there's a public library within walking distance of pretty much anywhere you live. And I realize that's not the reality for everyone. That being said, go research the library nearest to you, and if that library doesn't have the books you're looking for, you can usually do special requests for interlibrary loan or other types of requests. Just ask your librarians for help. They usually want to do their best to help you find what you need. Now, although this all might seem like an undisciplined approach to reading, as we'll see next, it's actually highly disciplined. It simply doesn't necessarily feel that way. Which brings us to our last step: create an accountability and review system. Now, originally it sounded like I was really against scheduling and structuring learning, but that couldn't be further from the truth. It's simply that the order is crucial. You see, if you try scheduling and structuring your reading and learning before they have become genuinely enjoyable to you through the creation of a book thread, you probably will fail in your efforts to actually implement such a structured approach. But now that you've created a book thread for yourself, you'll actually be motivated to create a schedule. You see, you remember how I said that just like with going to the gym, having a goal will get you started, but the tangible benefits of looking and feeling better will get you to stay consistent with it? Well, it's the same thing with reading. When I started to replace more of my screen time with reading time, something incredible happened. Yes, reading mentally stretched me, challenged me, and even fatigued me, just as going to the gym does that to your body. However, whereas after scrolling on social media made me ultimately feel depressed and anxious afterward, reading, I realized, made me feel refreshed and calm afterwards. It was a kind of mental fatigue, for sure, but it was a rewarding and fulfilling mental fatigue that ultimately made me feel more focused, more alert, and more mindful. And so, because I felt these tangible benefits, I was truly motivated to schedule in my calendar specific times I wanted to read specific books, and the added slight pressure of my having taken out so many books from the library that I ultimately needed to return pushed me just a bit more in this respect as well. And so a sort of study schedule on my part was born. But that study schedule wasn't complete without a specific time block in my calendar for review. You see, each week I have some specific time in my calendar blocked off to review my understanding of a concept I've been reading. Sometimes I do that by reviewing my notes, sometimes I do that by having ChatGPT drill me on the concept, and sometimes I simply get up in front of the room at home and do a kind of TED Talk on the concept, which makes me realize in the middle of my speech where certain gaps in my knowledge are. So, is scrolling on social media bad? Well, it's no worse than my chocolate chip muffin is that I eat on Saturday mornings. But guess what? Even though I still do scroll on social media, my screen time has been vastly reduced. And most importantly, I've regained control over my habit. I decide why I spend time on my phone, what the purpose is, and when. The time I spend there is no longer mindless. And isn't that the real goal? What will you get started with first? And where do you think you currently are in this process? I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you want to keep leveling up your critical thinking to make a massive impact, not only on your own life, but also on the lives of countless others, then be sure to watch this next video.